Today's episode is brought to you by my newest resource for women's health professionals, the Practitioner's Guide to Optimizing Egg Quality. This comprehensive guide breaks down the 5 key steps to improving egg quality, along with the top 5 evidence-based supplements to support egg development, mitochondrial health, and implantation potential. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/egg-quality to grab your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/egg-quality. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 589. In today's episode, we are digging into PMDD. I am sharing a research study that looked at mood, cognitive performance, appetite, how that changes for women with PMDD compared to women without PMDD. And we are going to look at the study findings. They measured hormone levels, what the implications are, and we're going to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of their approach. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode with a focus on PMDD. So the title of today's study, Changes in Mood, Cognitive Performance, and Appetite in the Late Luteal and Follicular Phases of the Menstrual Cycle in Women with and Without PMDD. This study was published in Hormones and Behavior, and I wanted to talk about it today because I feel like it really does highlight some of the differences between the way that the psychiatric community look at an issue like PMDD versus how you might look at PMDD if you track your menstrual cycles and are looking at the menstrual cycle as a really important factor in it. What I find to be most interesting about this study, as we will dive into, is that they essentially dismiss the hormonal implications of this. And that's really fascinating to me because by definition, how they define PMDD and how they define PMS. So I'll actually give you a bit of a quote for what they talk about. So PMDD is characterized primarily by a cluster of mood symptoms, especially depression, tension, anxiety, irritability, and fatigue, with 5 or more symptoms present during the luteal phase. So when they're defining PMDD, they're looking at a specific period of time. One of the things they're looking for is the appearance of these symptoms during the 5 to 7 days preceding the menstrual period. So they're saying these symptoms are specifically happening during that week before her period, and then they disappear in the follicular phase once the period is over. So if you think about this just logically for a moment, if these symptoms are simply appearing at that specific time of the cycle, every time she is in that phase of the cycle, then logically you would think, well, there must be a hormone component. But as we'll discuss, the researchers largely dismiss that component. We'll talk about why and what the implications are of that. So that kind of gives you a preview of what we're going to be talking about today. So in this, I guess I should say that from my perspective, based on looking at the research around PMDD, PMDD I often refer to as PMS's cousin or something like that. It's a really exacerbated version of PMS. And when we look at just the overall, I talked about this in the 5th vital sign. So 90% of women report some level of shift, change in their mood and their kind of symptomology during the week leading up to their period. And in the 5th vital sign, I compared the difference between what they refer to as menstrual molemina, which is an older medical term that refers to symptoms that shift. So if you're feeling a little bit more tired, if you're having some shifts in mood and energy during that time leading up to your period. But molemina would refer to shifts that are manageable and that don't disrupt your daily life, and comparing that to PMS or PMDD. So kind of looking at the mild version of this versus the moderate to severe situation that women are reporting. And when we cross over into the line of PMDD specifically, PMDD is typically identified when the symptoms are debilitating. So we've now crossed from mild, manageable symptoms, even moderate symptoms that are inconvenient, to full-on disruptive. You can't get to work, it's debilitating. And for a few days out of every cycle, you basically can't function, potentially can't go to work. So that would be the distinction between PMS and PMDD. And what I find interesting is that if you learn about PMDD and if you're kind of reading information about it, if you see articles about it, if people are talking about it online or however you're getting your information about PMDD, you would almost think that it's a completely separate and different condition to PMS. However, it is essentially like the worst version of it, if you really think about it, because it just goes from manageable, mild, to moderate, obviously disruptive, inconvenient, to debilitating. So if you think of it on the spectrum, PMDD is on the edge of that spectrum where it's starting to cause a significant issue in your life. And so in this study, what makes it, I suppose, unique and what they really looked at, what they were trying to do, is they were trying to look at some of the symptoms that women commonly report with PMDD in more of a systematic way. So they were looking at, as you mentioned, mood changes, changes in cognitive function, so memory, recall, tasks, and even balance, things like that, as well as food cravings. So they were looking at these specific symptoms, and they were kind of spot testing during different phases of the menstrual cycle and having these women complete questionnaires that were standardized testing questionnaires so that they can have a much better and more standardized understanding of how their cognition and mood and all of these different aspects were changing. And they also tracked hormones. And this is the part that I want to focus on as well, because what they did, to be clear, is they had these women, and I would say that they weren't necessarily tracking their cycles, not the way that we would understand tracking their cycles. They were identifying ovulation with LH testing, which is very common for research studies that are looking at the menstrual cycle and shifts and changes in the menstrual cycle. And on this podcast, we've talked extensively about some of the potential limitations for LH testing. Specifically, LH testing, when we experience the LH surge, the surge in luteinizing hormone, it is typically a precursor to ovulation. So once that LH surge takes place, ovulation is typically happening 36 hours-ish after that takes place. So LH by itself does not confirm that ovulation has taken place, but it is correlated with ovulation. So it's not to say it's not useful, but if we're looking to confirm ovulation, that's not necessarily confirming the specific date that happened. It's a precursor that they're looking at. And so how they measured estrogen and progesterone, which was really astounding to me, is that they would identify which phase of the cycle the woman was in, and they would do a salivary test once. So once in the pre-ovulatory phase, they did a salivary test in the morning, and they would identify the estradiol level that one day, and then once in the post-ovulatory phase. So literally like once a spot test, one day, one time, and then they base their study results on that. So that is astounding to me, because when we look at the menstrual cycle, even if you start to understand the hormone cycle and how that works, as a woman is approaching ovulation and she's in that follicular phase, the follicular phase by definition is when the follicle is developing. And the estrogen output is not just the same. It's not the same every hour of the day. So if you did multiple salivary tests throughout the day, you would see a bit of a change throughout the day. But throughout the cycle, there's a significant change, because as the follicle develops and grows, as a woman gets closer to ovulation, the estrogen levels significantly change and peak before that LH surge takes place. And we don't produce significant progesterone until after ovulation. But the progesterone level is very different, and it fluctuates throughout the post-ovulatory phase. So after a woman ovulates, the progesterone levels start to rise significantly. and they tend to peak mid-luteal. So they tend to peak about 7 days after ovulation, and then they start to fall. And this is what I find very interesting about this study. So if you're working with a practitioner who has been trained to actually look at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and has been trained to do spot testing throughout the cycle to determine the pattern of progesterone throughout the luteal phase. So if we're dealing with a woman that has PMS or PMDD, and like I said, logically, you're thinking, okay, so this is literally defined by this woman having significant changes in her mood, in her cognition, in her appetite, specifically during the week before her period. And we know that there are women who don't experience those symptoms, or women who experience those symptoms to a greater degree. So the period of time in question would be the 7 days leading up to menstruation. So logically, I mean, I would love to design a study. I mean, I know I have bias. I know I have but at the end of the day, if we're looking at this specific period of time, the 7 days leading up to ovulation, leading up to menstruation, wouldn't it make logical sense to not just test the progesterone one random day in the entire luteal phase? Wouldn't it make sense to have full systematic tracking of the menstrual cycle where we actually have this woman charting? And yes, we can do the LH test, but why don't we also test mucus? Why don't we also test BBT and actually be able to have a few different markers to confirm? You could even do the progesterone test, right, on specific days. Progesterone is a great way to confirm ovulation happened because we're not producing significant progesterone until after ovulation. So there's lots of ways that we could do this in a more scientific manner to get a closer, more accurate assessment of the day of ovulation. And then what would happen if we tested the progesterone? Not just, like, I'm telling you, I'm stuck on this. Like, I'm astounded that they literally tested it once. So what would happen if they tested the progesterone every 3 days? Or if they did those spot tests of hormone levels? You know, they did it 3 days after ovulation, 6 days after ovulation, 9 days after ovulation, right? Like, what if they spot tested it and actually for each woman, they had a curve of progesterone that we could actually put on a graph for the entire luteal phase so that we could actually see the difference in progesterone levels during the period of time in question, which is the 5 to 7 days leading up to their menstrual period. So you can see where I'm going with this. So these researchers, like I said, I can't let it go. I'm sorry. I just keep bringing it up. They tested progesterone once. Did you know that you can listen to Real Food for Fertility for free with your 30-day trial of Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/realfood to listen now. That's fertilityfriday.com/realfood. And so when we look at what they found, if we look at the study results, so when they tested for mood, cognition, changes in appetite, they did find that women with PMDD, so again, they're on the end of that spectrum, they have the maximum, most debilitating symptoms in this specific phase of their cycle, they showed clear and consistent changes across mood, memory, and appetite in the luteal phase. So they had significantly higher depression and anxiety scores. They had more negative mood ratings, and those ratings were more negative compared to their own scores in the follicular phase. So in this study, they actually looked at the women and had them do these kind of spot surveys at different points in their own cycle. So they were able to compare the data to other times of their cycle. So compared to their own follicular phase, it was significantly worse. But then, of course, they also had a control group, women who did not have PMDD. So compared to the women without PMDD, there was a significant difference in these symptoms, again, and I stress, during that week before their menstrual period. And so what they said here, cognitively, if we look at kind of the overall findings, the performance dropped, especially on delayed word and number recall tasks. So they had these women doing these different tasks, these standardized tests, and they would have them, if they could recall maybe a certain number list, or if they could recall certain tasks, like their cognition was was noticeably significantly off especially for the women who had the more severe symptoms, PMDD. And then when it came to appetite, they didn't only crave more high fat foods, but they actually consumed about 100 more calories at lunchtime, primarily from fat and protein. So in this study, what they did is they would have these women come into the clinic and they would give them lunch. And they didn't tell them that they were tracking anything related to the food. They would just say, you can eat whatever you want. So they didn't tell them you had to eat all of it or anything like that. They would just give them the lunch. And then they would weigh it, before and after so they could determine about what they ate. And that's how they measured the food consumption. So they did find that there were these significant differences. And so I would say what the study did well is that, although I think one of the things that they did well was they did use these standardized tests to determine the changes in cognition, mood. They tested the food intake very specifically because they measured what they were eating. So they did control for a lot of it. And for what it's worth, they did make an effort to get the data from the correct phase of the cycle. But as I've already mentioned, I feel like given the fact that these symptoms are specific to a specific phase of the cycle, I don't feel like they went far enough to really gather the data and make the conclusions that they used. In terms of the hormone findings specifically, the researchers actually found, and they stated in their study, that there was no significant difference between the estradiol levels and the progesterone levels of either group. So this is what I have been alluding to, and I just want to hang out here for a moment. So what they did, again, is that they tested the hormone levels once. So out of they said here that all of the women in the study had ovulatory menstrual cycles that range from 23 to 33 days. And when examining hormone levels as a function of group and phase, estradiol levels were not significantly different in the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase in the PMDD and control group. Regarding progesterone, there was a main effect of phase. And what they're saying is that progesterone levels were higher in the luteal phase than the follicular phase, but beyond the shift, obviously, and that's because we don't produce significant progesterone until after ovulation. But beyond that, they were saying that both groups were the same. And so it's like, okay, conversation's over. We don't have to continue to talk about this. There's no effective hormones. And so the researchers go on to suggest that although we can clearly see that this is a repetitive thing that is happening for these women and that these symptoms are worsening at a very specific point in the cycle over and over again. So they're having menstrual cycle after menstrual cycle. They're experiencing this significant increase in symptoms during the 5 to 7 days leading up to their period. They're saying, but we spot tested it once and there was no real difference between subjects. So therefore, it's not hormonal. And so we need to look at other alternatives. So what the researchers suggest for women with PMDD is SSRIs. So they are suggesting psychiatric medication. They're saying that the psychiatric medication works. We've seen studies that show that it works. And they also dismiss the potential for even progesterone replacement therapy because they're saying that it's not hormonal. And they're saying, well, maybe it's since the hormones were the same, then maybe it's just that women with PMDD are more sensitive to hormones and that's why they're responding differently. So like I said, I want to hang out here because as I already laid out, you cannot get an actual scientific, legit comparison of hormones in a cycle when we know that hormones fluctuate. We know that there's a rise and fall. And when we look at research that has actually looked more deeply at that rise and fall of hormone levels, we can see that women who have PMS and PMDD symptoms are more likely to have an atypical progesterone pattern in that luteal phase. So when we actually don't just like check one random day in the luteal, but when we do a systematic series of hormone testing, you can actually see that women who have increased PMS symptoms in that phase of the cycle, instead of having a kind of rise and a peak mid-luteal, you can see that potentially that, and then a rise, peak mid-luteal, and then a gradual drop in hormones over that second half, right? So in a healthy, normal cycle where a woman would have very minimal PMS symptoms, you would see a gradual dip. And the interesting thing when you have women charting their cycles is that when you have somebody tracking their temperature and tracking their mucus, you also get this kind of indirect view of what's happening hormonally. And so it's not uncommon for women who are having more significant PMS symptoms to show different changes in their charts during the luteal phase, whether that's we see temperatures dropping or erratic temperatures, whether we see the luteal phase actually itself being shorter. And so for the record, in this particular study, they didn't measure specifically the length of the follicular or luteal phases. They measured the total cycle length. They estimated the day of ovulation with the LH testing, and they did a spot test, but they did not identify the specific length of those phases. So we don't know if the women in the study who had PMDD, if the length of their luteal phase was any different than the control group. We don't know if there was any significant difference. We don't know if there was any spotting premenstrually or any of the other symptoms that tend to be correlated with low progesterone. So certainly I would say that the way that they did the study, it's just how can I say it? The way that they did the study is potentially just the laziest, least scientific way to truly evaluate if this is a problem. Again, it's so interesting to me when you don't look at these issues that are happening cyclically that clearly have a menstrual cycle component, when you don't look at it from the lens of the menstrual cycle and you don't think that the fact that it is a condition defined by happening at a specific time of the cycle, you don't think to really investigate that phase. If this is the phase that it's happening in, then why aren't we making an effort to actually look at that phase? So compare the hormone levels of that specific period of time in the control group to the women who are having PMDD. Like, obviously, this isn't just a thing that every single woman experiences. So if there are women who are having these severe symptoms to the point that they can't go to work and it's super debilitating, then why aren't we looking at it more deeply and actually looking at the cycle as a vital sign? Because clearly it's giving us information. Okay, so I'm going to jump off of that, because I could go on for the rest of the day. But this is a huge problem, because then what happens is this study, their conclusion is that there's not really a hormonal issue. Like, although we can see that it's happening at a certain point in the cycle, we tested the hormones and it's totally fine, right? There's no hormonal component whatsoever. They just drop it as if they've actually fully investigated it, right? But they didn't. They didn't fully investigate it. So then what you have is them concluding that really the only solution for women is to go on psychiatric medication. This is a psychiatric problem. It's just coincidental that it happens to be going on at this part of the cycle consistently. And even though that's part of the definition, we just need to get them on psychiatric meds. So clearly the implications of this line of thinking and this level of research and just this bias towards psychiatric medication for conditions that are clearly related to the menstrual cycle, and also even just the lack of understanding. I don't think these researchers were malicious. I think that they actually felt at the time that they were following very sound methodological standards, right? Because they did use the LH testing to confirm ovulation. So isn't that just so simple? And of course, it didn't occur to them to actually test more than one. Like, they thought, okay, well, we'll just test for that progesterone one time on one day. And that's going to give us the full insight of what's going on. So the implications of this are clear. I think that women are still experiencing these symptoms, but because we're not looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, we're not really investigating it to the level that it needs to be investigated at. And so this is one of the challenges when you're having conversations, potentially even with professionals, and you're wanting to know more about the menstrual cycle, or you're wanting to dig deeper into your symptoms. You're wanting to find out, well, this is happening with my cycle. I've been charting. There must be something going on here. This is potentially one of the reasons why these concerns are sometimes, whether it's that they're just not addressed or that they're not taken seriously, because we have literal peer-reviewed published studies that would say that it's not really a hormonal issue. Even though when you look at the study and how they did it, there's clear issues with it. Like, you can't make a conclusion based on this study, I would say. I would say firmly, you can't make an actual conclusion. You would have to actually do a proper study where we're looking at that phase more specifically before you can rule out that there's a hormone component. And so I suppose this is a reminder. This is certainly one of the reasons why I do this research series. I do it because it gives me an opportunity to talk specifically about specific papers, to go in to talk about their findings and discuss why sometimes we're seeing these types of findings. So I think with research, it's always important to remember that this field of research is not infallible. The researchers have biases. They also have gaps in knowledge. We all have biases. We all have gaps in knowledge. So if I was doing a research study, I would have to outline to the best of my ability what my biases are. And that's why you need to have a peer review process, because if there's gaps in my knowledge, you need to have peers and experts to be able to say, okay, but you didn't look at this part, you didn't look at this part. But this is my point. There's no one study that's going to prove everything for the end of time. We have to continue to build on research. And that is built into research in many ways, because when you're looking at the study, they are reviewing other similar studies that have been done. They're outlining what those studies did well, what potentially could have been improved. And whenever research is put out, these researchers are attempting to make it better. So they're saying, okay, the previous researchers, they didn't really measure the actual food. They didn't weigh it. So while they were finding differences in appetite, we're going to improve on their design, and we're going to try to make sure that we get a better view of that so we can be more sure of our results. And in that same way, I would say with this study, they did a lot well, but the next step would be to actually look more thoroughly and specifically at the luteal phase. And I do have a comment about that, because what happens if we do that study and we see that there is a clear difference in the hormonal composition of women with PMDD versus PMS? What happens? PMDD is extremely common. PMS is extremely common. And the standard of care at this point, obviously, is to put these women on psychiatric medication. So if we actually have a study that shows that this is not necessarily an imbalance of serotonin or all of the psychiatric approach to mental health, and there is a significant difference in hormone levels, what happens then? Because, for example, bioidentical progesterone, that's not something that can necessarily be patented. That's not necessarily something that you can make a medication for. So the way our system is designed is that these companies are trying to make a profit. And in order to make a profit, they need to create something that they can patent. So they can't just sell the bioidenticals, because everybody can sell that. They have to create a slight variation on that, a different molecular structure that they can specifically patent so that they can make a profit. So this is one of the issues. So again, when looking at research, I think it's really important for us not to look at research as this be all and end all objective science only situation. Science is involved, but who's funding the studies and what would be the benefit of the industry who's making profit off of this specific approach and having women use psychiatric medication for this, something that can be patented, right? Something that they can earn a profit on. What would be the benefit of showing that those approaches could potentially provide equal or even less promising results than simply improving lifestyle factors to boost progesterone or potentially administering bioidentical progesterone in the specific phase of the cycle? Popping into today's episode to let you know about our newest resource for women's health professionals, the Practitioner's Guide to Optimizing Egg Quality. This comprehensive guide breaks down the 5 key steps to improving egg quality, along with the top 5 evidence-based supplements to support egg development, mitochondrial health, and implantation potential. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/egg quality to grab your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/egg quality. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So I would say that we're not always, the research, the way it's designed, isn't always giving a fair shot. Again, the researchers are already biased towards this approach and against the hormonal approach. And then in this study in particular, they actually talk a little bit about, some studies have looked at the potential of replacing progesterone replacement, but they haven't really shown much promise. One of the things that I will continue to talk about, the limitations of research related to menstrual cycle things that are happening at certain times of the menstrual cycle or identifying certain functions like ovulation and things like that. When you look at the study design, the studies are being designed by individuals who are not knowledgeable around fertility awareness methods and body literacy and even just the menstrual cycle in general. So when you're looking at the way that they're designing the studies, they're not thinking about the menstrual cycle like we are thinking about the menstrual cycle. So even if they are administering progesterone, if they are not having these women track their cycles, confirm ovulation, not just do an LH test, but actually confirm ovulation, if they're not consistently doing that, if they're basing their tests on the 28-day myth and having these women take progesterone on day 21 or have them take progesterone on day 14 or whatever they're doing, then when their study shows that this method isn't effective or isn't helping or whatever, that's why we have to really look at these studies with a keen eye. So when you see a research paper and they're saying, well, there's no hormonal component, and they're saying, well, the previous studies on progesterone haven't been effective, so therefore it's not a hormonal issue, and really we need to just give them psychiatric medication, we have to actually dissect what that means so that we're not just taking that at face value. Because I just picked this study apart with regards to their conclusion that there's no hormonal component. They cannot conclude that based on how they did this research, but they did, and it's published and it's out there. And so you can have professionals that say, well, there's no hormonal component. This has been studied. So we really have to be very critical of these research studies. We really have to be able to review them, look at them with a critical eye. We can't just take what they're saying for face value, because at this stage of this point in time that we are in, the menstrual cycle is not being looked at as a vital sign. It is not being looked at, especially in the psychiatric world. It is not being looked at as a specific factor. And they're certainly not studying it according to what we talked about here, they're not studying it in a scientific way. So naturally, I wanted to release this episode after last week's episode with Dr. Katie Marwick. I mean, the conversation that we had was so fascinating. She was the author of the paper, The Menstrual Cycle, an Overlooked Sign in Psychiatry. And so I feel like this paper plus her interview highlights this really huge hole and gap in the field of psychiatry. Now, I certainly do not specialize in psychiatry, and I obviously have limited knowledge in that field, but the implications of this are very significant. The implications of this, and also beyond the implication of the potential contribution of hormones, hormone replacement therapy to this conversation, the lack of knowledge and expertise, the lack of understanding and how that filters into how these studies are designed and the approach that it's taken, kind of the assumption that there's no hormonal input. So they're kind of giving it lip service even when they're designing the studies, because they don't really anticipate seeing any significant contributing factor. And even the lack of knowledge of how the menstrual cycle works. There's this, I would say, systemic overconfidence in the health field, in the medical field, in the psychiatric field, where you're highly educated, right? You've spent tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on your education. You spent years in school, and compared to the average person, your knowledge is leaps and bounds about physiology, about hormone health, reproduction, whatever it is. Yet when we come to the menstrual cycle and we come to the things that we talk about on this podcast, we come to the concept of fertility awareness. We come to the concept of tracking mucus and temperature and understanding how the hormonal shifts impact the cycle and how the broader impacts of those fluctuations and changes impact overall health. This is an area where most health professionals have zero education, if not less. And so there's a significant overconfidence in just all things menstrual cycles. So that's reflected in the research as well. So I was excited to share today's episode and just share this take on it. I hope that for those of you who've wondered why this is missing from these different areas of health, these different areas of medicine, science, hopefully this sheds some light on it and also highlights a really key aspect of potentially moving forward. We have to be critical of the research. So we've gotten to a point where we really rely on evidence-based strategies. We rely heavily on the scientific evidence. And obviously that's a big part of my work. And And I think it's extremely important to be able to rely on the evidence. But with that said, we can't just take every paper that's published and assume that everything was done that's just perfect and researchers have no bias and there's no influences potentially in terms of who's funding it or which industry benefits from different findings of different papers and potentially which industries want to make sure to maintain that status quo so that their finances don't change. That there's industries that rely on women not understanding this information. Their whole industry relies on it because if we really saw how ineffective their treatments were, that the whole house of cards would come crumbling down and women would demand alternate treatments, right? So we have to look at all of these things critically and really think about, okay, so what are the implications really here? Is their conclusion legit? Can they even be saying that? So I'll leave you with those thoughts and I'll be posting and sharing about this on social media when it comes out. So you can find me at Fertility Friday. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this episode. So feel free to message us over there, DM us over there. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this topic because, like I said, I almost couldn't believe it. Like when I read the paper and I saw that they literally tested this once and made these broad sweeping conclusions about it, I read it multiple times. I read it over and over. I was like, wait a minute. They only tested it once? Like what? Like one time in the whole cycle? What's going on? What? Excuse me? So I was really just like amazed that this is where we're at. And I really hope that future study designs are looking at this more critically. So if you are wanting to learn more about this particular study, head over to fertilityfriday.com/589. So that's where you'll find the show notes, you'll find the summary, you'll also find the link to the study that we talked about. So fertilityfriday.com/589. If you enjoyed today's episode and you can think of someone who would appreciate it, if you're wanting to share it with somebody, hey, if you're working with a psychiatrist or a psychologist and you are experiencing severe PMDD, feel free to share it along. This is one of the ways that the podcast has grown over the years. And so I certainly appreciate all of you who've been sharing the podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, then I would encourage you to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. That also really helps listeners to know what the podcast is about when they're searching for a new podcast or if they've just found it. Of course, what do? We go straight to the reviews. So if you've been enjoying the podcast, I would invite you to leave a review there. I try to look at all of the reviews every so often. So if you leave a review, I will definitely see it. So with that said, enjoy the rest of your weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. If you're loving the podcast and you're ready to apply fertility awareness strategies in your women's health practice, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship. It's a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Our next class starts in January 2026, so there's still time to reserve your spot. There's no other program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to apply now. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive.